Hello, my name is Katrina, and this week's crafting episode is going to be all about the history of knitting. So let's get started right away. If you have finished my other two episodes where we learned how to knit a dishcloth, you might find some of this interesting. So the oldest existing knitting that they actually physically have in hand is from the 11th century in Egypt. It was a sock with short row shaping, and short row just means that instead of going all the way across the row and then back, they only go partially back and forth, which forms a curve. So that's what even today we do our heels of a sock with short rows. So it had short row shaping in the heel. Because of the complexity, they are assuming that there was probably knitting going on way before that. That would certainly not be your first project as a sock. I knitted for several years before I made my first pair of socks. So we know that it predates the 11th century. Early Europeans in the 13th century, knitting was done by some of the Muslims for the royal families. At that time, lace was very popular, and so a lot of that was being done by them. And examples of this lace have been found in the tombs. There's also examples in Estonia, which are known for these very famous knitted lace shawls that are knitted so finely. They're called wedding ring shawls because you can literally take your wedding ring off and slide the entire shawl through the wedding ring. That's how delicate they were. And those are known as Estonian shawls. They also were very intricate using color work. And artwork of the day depicts people knitting. There are some pictures, some very classic pictures of Mary, the mother of Jesus, knitting. I don't know that really exists, but it was just popular, so they put that in there. So, so there's a lot of artwork with famous figures knitting. The very first purl and yarn over stitches, which we did in the dishcloth pattern, those appear in Europe in the mid-16th century. Knitting schools were established to provide incomes, and the high fashion of the day were silk stockings, and some of those silk stockings still exist. I cannot imagine knitting silk stockings, but that was very popular. The cable stitch, which you see on a lot of sweaters, it kind of looks like a twisted rope, that was developed in Ireland in the 1800s. Knitting was an important occupation in Scotland from the 16 and 1700s. Whole families knitted. Fair Isle knit, which was made popular in the 1920s, which incorporates different colors together in a sweater. Those were worn by fishermen to protect them from the cold. Because you're knitting with two separate yarns to create the color work, the sweater is actually doubly thick. They also used those sweaters to identify drowning victims because your wife would be making the sweater for you. She knew what the sweater looked like, and if you were drowned, a lot of times it was used to identify whose body it was based on the design of the sweater itself. The first knitting machine was invented in 1589. Queen Elizabeth I did not like the stockings that were produced from the knitting machine and was afraid it would take away from the people who were using knitting as a cottage industry. France did want the knitting machine and wanted to use it, so the man who invented it moved to France and opened the first factory there. Nottingham in the UK became known for lace machine knitting, and Leicestershire and the surrounding counties for hosier, or, your hose, things like that they wore a lot back in the 15 and 1600s. Here in the U.S., the first spinning mill is Slater Mill, and it's in Pawtucket, Rhode Island. And you can actually Google it and you can go see it. It is open for tours. My husband and I went there a few years ago, and it's very interesting. They weren't weaving cloth there. The whole section from Rhode Island up through the northernmost part of Massachusetts were known as spinning and for weaving. One of the biggest weaving mills in the country was Lowell, Massachusetts, which is now owned by the mills are actually owned by the National Park Service. So you can take a tour of them. You can also look at them online. They were operated by water power and then later by electric power. But the first spinning mill would have been Slater Mill, like I said, in Pawtucket, Rhode Island. And I've been there as well, and you can tour the grounds. They weren't weaving, they were just strictly spinning the yarn that would then be sent elsewhere to be woven into cloth and then made into clothing. And it was a completely water-powered mill. So there were water, the belts and the gears and everything that were actually doing the spinning of the material into yarn. And then it would be, of course, knitted from there or woven or whatever. Knitting has been used for troops in all of our wars here in the U.S. Many first ladies were also known as being knitters and promoting knitting, and as well as some famous characters and actresses that you would recognize. So the first one would be Martha Washington, who knitted socks for the troops during the Revolutionary War and encouraged other women to knit as well. She had a knitting circle that would get together and knit socks for the soldiers during the Revolutionary War. Lucy Coolidge, President Coolidge's wife, was a very avid knitter and crocheter. In fact, she submitted an anonymous baby layette into Vogue Knitting and won honorable mention. She knitted her own socks, and they even were monogrammed, her own silk stockings. And she designed and crocheted a bed cover that's like lacy-looking doilies that is still used in the Lincoln bedroom today. And it was her wish that each consecutive First Lady would contribute something in the handicrafts to be left as a legacy in the White House. So that was Lucy Coolidge. But some other women who were First Ladies also did a little bit of contributing. The first one would be Lou Hoover. This would be President Herbert Hoover's wife. And here is a picture of her knitting in front of a fireplace at the White House. And then probably the most famous first woman for knitting would be Eleanor Roosevelt. And here's a picture of her. She's in the middle, knitting. Now, the stories with Eleanor Roosevelt were that she carried a knitting bag with her everywhere. During World War II, she encouraged women that were knitters to pick up their knitting needles and to make sweaters for the soldiers during World War II. Now, there was even more to it than that. Because they had to keep the sweaters had to look, blend with the uniforms. They couldn't do like red and, purple and blue. They couldn't do, any color sweater they wanted. If you were knitting something for the troops, you had to use an approved pattern and an approved yarn color, which was like an ecru off-white kind of color, or kind of a tannish color, or an olive green color. And so you had to be making something that were in those approved colors with an approved pattern. You would go to the store and you could buy all the supplies that you needed right there at your local store, and then you could knit them for the soldiers. And it's interesting because I have a distant relative, which was AbbyAldrich Rockefeller. And her husband is the one that did some of the work, did the restoration work for Williamsburg, Virginia. And there is a picture of her sitting on her front lawn in Williamsburg, and she's knitting an olive drab sweater. So I kind of guess, and it was done around the 40s, so I'm guessing it was probably one of those sweaters that we're talking about. But anyway, Eleanor Roosevelt encouraged women across the United States to make sweaters. Her goal was 1 million sweaters. And I'm not sure if they made it or not, but I just thought that was kind of interesting. Another famous knitter is Sojourner Truth, who is famous for, she was an African-American woman who led a lot of slaves north to safety during the Civil War. And here is a picture of her knitting, and the white shawl she is wearing is she was famous for always wearing that one. And yeah, she was very proud of her knitting, and she was an avid knitter. And so you can tell when she had her picture made, she made sure that her knitting was in it. The book I'm using, it's now currently out of print. It's called A Social History of American Knitting, No Idle Hands. So it is a book that's out of print now, but it's very interesting because, like I said, it goes through a lot of the history of knitting. Other famous knitters: Joan Crawford, Katharine Hepburn. Coco Chanel wasn't necessarily, I don't think she knitted, but she embraced knitting in fashion and encouraged it, and that kind of promoted some of the popularity of it at the time. Now, something interesting to note, there are different types of knitting needles. There are straight knitting needles. There are circular knitting needles, which are for knitting in the round, although like I'm doing right now, I'm knitting just back and forth, but I'm using double-pointed needles, which are easier on your hands because the weight all hangs here. I'm making a shawl, by the way, but all of the weight hangs in the center, not on the needles themselves here, which is harder on your wrist, especially if you're making something big like a sweater or an afghan or something like that. So there's circular needles, there's the straight needles, and then there are what are called double-pointed needles. Double-pointed needles are straight, but they have a point on each end. Instead of a stopper on the end, they have a point on each end. And they are used for knitting circularly. Before they came out with circular needles like this, they had double-pointed needles. They come in a set of like 4 to 5 needles. You can use double-pointed needles today for knitting socks. So these still are in use today. But of the 3 types of knitting needles, take a guess at which one was used first. If you guessed double-pointed needles, you're correct. Double-pointed needles came out first, and knitting was originally all done in the round. It wasn't till later, like this is being knitted, what we would call being knitted flat, because I'm going just back and forth and back and forth. They didn't used to do this. Everything was a double thickness because they were knitting it around like that. So double-pointed needles were the very first needles, then straight needles, and then lastly, the circular needles. And the circular needles came out in the 1920s. So that is just a real tiny brief history of the craft of knitting, and I hope you have enjoyed it. And the next segment we're going to do will be, I think, interesting for anybody who likes to knit or crochet. And what it is going to be is the different weights of yarn, how yarn is produced. I have a spinning wheel, and I'm going to demonstrate how a spinning wheel is used and how it actually turns the fleece into yarn. So we're going to take a look at that and a little bit of the history of a spinning wheel. And I'm also going to talk about different types of fiber and how they spin up a little bit differently, and a little bit about what they come from and how they are processed. So I hope you tune in for the next lesson, and thank you for coming by today.